On December 24, 1999, our family gathered at a table that had held holidays and arguments, homework and advice, generations of small mercies and petty economies. It was the kind of table that held the residue of lives, spilled salt, coffee rings, a map of priorities mapped in the dents and stains of everyday use. The house smelled of roast and citrus. The tree lights blurred at the edges of conversation into something like gold. It was Christmas Eve on the cusp of a new millennium. The calendar offered itself as a punctuation mark, and for that night at least, the year's anxieties unfastened long enough to make room for ritual. My mother arrived with the careful theatricality she had long cultivated. She carried small wrapped packages, hand-picked items that read like an outline of a life. A tin of tea for the sister who needed morning ritual, gloves for a neighbor whose hands were always cold, a paperback for a cousin who never stopped moving long enough to read. She distributed them with a practiced, slightly exaggerated grace. "One please," she joked, the phrase softer than command, more an invitation to notice. At the table she corrected stories about relatives, added a bit of detail here, abridged a recollection there. She performed the role of the family biographer, lightly editing, lubricating the conversation's flow. In the retelling that followed, that Christmas came to stand as a hinge. Family stories are often told by returning to a particular image or night that seems to mark a before and after. For us, late December 1999 crystallized into such an emblem, a night of generosity and performance that, in hindsight, hinted at quieter performances to come. Over the years it became the sentence from which we would expand the paragraph of explanation about what changed. The memory of that table, of light and tea tins and the soft insistence of my mother's jokes, became a way to say that, at some point, ordinary patterns had started to shift. But the first moment I could name as carrying consequence for our daily life was not the Christmas night. It arrived on a far more prosaic afternoon, June 18, 2000, at a neighborhood barbecue. We stood around a long wooden picnic table, the kind that holds a block's worth of laughter and gossip. The smell of charred meat hung in the air, along with basil and summer sweetness rising from grill and cutting board. My mother, usually the one who navigated a room like a conductor, moved a little uncertainly in the flow of people and dishes. She reached for 2 plates at once. An uncle, fond of teasing and assuming social dominance, called out cheerfully for her to put one down. She bristled, an automatic indignation I had seen many times before, and in that suspended microsecond I expected fissure, something private to fracture into the public seam. She huffed and then, with a practiced concession, put the extra plate down. There was a ridiculous, private relief in my chest when things ended ordinarily. But even as we laughed and moved on, a ledger in my head, informal, subjective, shivered. Was this a stray, social misstep in a crowd, or a sign? How to interpret an almost invisible moment of miscalibration? Over the coming years that ledger would be the instrument by which I tracked a series of small occurrences and asked what they might add up to. Sometimes the balance tipped toward charity. Other times it leaned toward diagnosis. Incidents accumulated. On June 9, 2001, at the farmer's market where a vendor arranged oranges in bands of color like a quiet painter, my mother fumbled and paid twice for a small bag of fruit. The vendor, familiar, patient, a man who recognized our faces and the rhythms of our purchases, laughed and threatened to charge her for a pie if she persisted. There was neighborly forgiveness in his tone that deflated anxiety into a joke. She called herself taken for a fool, a theatrical phrase she loved, and we sat beneath the awning until she could make the moment smaller. We called the vendor and, with his good humor, turned the episode into less than a headline. "Tell her to come back for a pie," he said, and the world did not split. Yet that day lodged itself with other small lapses, each one registering in the ledger that had, by then, a modest history of notes and margins. From 2001 through 2004 the language of care shifted in our lives from hypotheticals to scaffolding. We were the kind of family that had long nodded at the idea of wills and powers of attorney as the civilized thing to do, but practical engagement with those things had still felt abstract, the sort of work one might defer indefinitely. The early years of the new century were different. Conversations about fiduciary responsibility, powers of attorney, and the legalities of care moved from being unpleasant possibilities to everyday architecture. We sat in the kitchen with pens and pamphlets from in-home support agencies that smelled faintly of copier ink and the official start of bureaucracy. It felt a little like renovating a home while still living inside it, cautious, practical, attentive to load-bearing walls. We wrote lists and set down names. We scheduled 2 afternoons a week with a paid caregiver. Someone who would bring groceries, help clean, and provide the company that rescued hours otherwise spent alone. We grappled with the checkbook. My mother, who had been fiercely proud of her independence, treated these new arrangements as negotiations of dignity. We argued about who would hold online access to her accounts and how often I should check the balances. We logged receipts and appointments. We noted whose car took her to physical therapy and who had driven 20 miles in winter to sit in a sterile waiting room. These entries were not merely administrative, they were a map of everyday ethics in the making. In March 2002, the ledger, sometimes a literal notebook, sometimes a file on my computer, took on the tone of a diary of domestic negotiation. Caregiver hired, prefers Earl Grey and chatty music, pay half her fee from mother's account because she insisted on retaining dignity by paying, mileage for physical therapy logged, checkbook reconciled. Those notes recorded more than money. They chronicled the choreography of agency and care, who would do the washing, who would fetch prescriptions, who would listen when memory faltered. The ledger became an instrument of accountability and tenderness simultaneously. My sister became central to this choreography. She was the practical sibling, tending to the arithmetic of our new lives. Why are we spending this? Why have we let that slide? Her language was less theatrical than mine. She measured rather than dramatized. We fought in the currency of family disputes, over mileage reimbursement, whether our mother could safely remain in her apartment, whether the missing watch should be mentioned at a family meeting or left to fade. Underneath those disagreements lay a deeper question. What kind of family did we intend to be? One that used accountability to steady and support, or one that kept a record of grievances like a set of talismans? Over time we learned to make space for anger without letting it calcify. We developed a language that allowed us to say what was wrong and insist on repair while still keeping the door open. Anger could be a punctuation, not a permanent edifice. That small, negotiated balance, name the wrong, insist on repair, but do not let it harden into exile, was one of the difficult arts we had to learn. Throughout this period my husband was ballast. He had carried his own family difficulties and, perhaps because of that, he understood the difference between accountability and punishment. He would sit at our scratched kitchen table and ask questions that made space for memory rather than correcting it. What did you wish for then? He would ask my mother in a voice that meant no judgment, only permission. She looked at him with a kind of astonishment, as though someone had handed her permission to be honest for the first time. He did not correct as much as he collected. In his presence, my mother could rearrange pieces of herself without fear of collapsing into shame. Those moments were small, but they were significant. They helped us tease narrative threads back into shape without shredding them. Despite the formalization of powers of attorney and caregiver schedules, my mother continued to find ways to act on old impulses. On occasion she mailed checks she had no authority to send. She slipped envelopes into my bag to relieve distant relatives who called in panic. I discovered the checks because I still monitored accounts online. In one instance she had tucked an envelope into my purse as if planning a secret gesture of generosity. When I asked her about it, she answered with defiance wrapped in panic. I couldn't stand it. He sounded so scared. Shame followed quickly. I had to respond with a voice that was both small and firm, then call me next time. The line needed to be a boundary, not a punishment. She listened, and after a long pause uttered, "Okay." That simple assent became one of the contractual phrases of our life, a sign of willingness to be guided and a practical rehearsal in restraint. We invented rituals to hold what law could not legislate. In 2003, we began a small practice at Thanksgiving. After turkey and pies, we passed out cards and asked each person to write an intention for the coming year. Pay the neighbor for the dog walking, call your mother once a week, save for a trip, come to the family meeting. We read them aloud, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with a blush. My mother once wrote, "Pay back what I owe," then crossed it out and replaced it with "make amends in small ways." The crossing out felt more revealing than either sentence. It showed the work of transforming a verb of taking into a verb of repair. The ritual made ethics habit. It was not moral theater, it was practice. Parenthood reframed everything. My son was born in 2005, and his arrival rerouted ordinary rhythms through the lens of the responsibilities we had taken on. Caring for a parent while parenting a child created a strange concurrency. Two people at opposite ends of a life's arc depended on me in ways I had not anticipated. My son asked direct questions about fairness and hurting. Did Grandma really not give you a present at Christmas? He demanded in 2010, blunt and morally insistent. I told the story simply and then layered it. People can be generous and confused, mean and suffering simultaneously. People can hurt and try to make amends. He listened with the hunger of a child and then asked about treats. Through him I learned how to shape the grammar of family stories so that accountability could be understood as a path to belonging rather than as an exit. My mother kept returning to old habits with bewildering speed. She would hide small purchases, later pretending a sweater had been hers for years. She began to write in the ledger in her own hand as if her script might erase the record. When hidden things surfaced, we returned them. When secrets came to light, we brought the ledger to the table and counted. Restitution was rarely only monetary. Sometimes it looked like money, other times it was acts, hours of weeding my garden, washing dishes on Sunday, sitting with my son during errands. The currency of repair shifted as age moved our moral economy toward visibility. Secrecy was the enemy because secrecy allowed old patterns to continue. Once an action was visible, it could be acknowledged, exchanged, and recorded. The ledger turned shame into labor. The body began to speak its own language. On a wet afternoon in October 2007, she slipped on the stoop and fractured her wrist. That injury demanded more help, more check-ins, altered routines. We added Rosa to the household rotation. Rosa visited 3 times a week, practical and garrulous. She spoke to my mother as one woman to another. "You look like you used to when you were young," Rosa told her once. And my mother cried because few people reflect back the face you keep inside your body. Rosa rearranged our days with small habits, reminding to take medication, aligning socks in drawers, making the bed. Practical things that made life seem less fractured. Physical vulnerability forced a recalibration of independence. Dementia, silent, patient, hovered at the edges of our conversations by the late 2000s. We sometimes skirted the word at family dinners because naming it felt like conceding something irrevocable. Yet evidence accumulated in clinical pamphlets, in the doctors' scored tests, in behaviors we kept watch for. She repeated stories. She got briefly lost on a route she had taken for years. Once, during a bright hour in March 2011, she called me by my sister's name and then apologized for the mistake and for apologizing. We learned to let certain things go and to hold others firm for safety. We set rules, one question at a time, a number by the bed, a small list of people to call when confusion rose. These were pragmatic, choreographed responses intended to keep everyone in place. Within our private family myth, the stolen watch loomed as a small scandal, emblematic more than material. The watch had gone missing sometime in late 2006. Its disappearance required negotiation and ceremony when it returned, visible restitution, public apology, ritual that transformed a theft into a lesson. The watch, which would appear intermittently in drawers and occasionally be worn to steady identity, became a talisman of loss and repair. When my son was old enough to understand that objects circulate for reasons other than market value, he accepted the watch with reverence. He asked bluntly whether it had been stolen. I told him simply, it had been taken, and we learned how to ask and to pay back. The watch, in time, found itself on his wrist as he took his first airplane rides, a small circle that caught the light and suggested memory. Not every register of trouble was dramatic or legally discreet. There were nights when the accounting of duty and love felt like a heavy ledger in my chest. At times I fantasized about a tidy ending, closing the door and pronouncing a clean moral, but real life refused the neat closure of fiction. The paradox was constant: cultivate an edge and hold a softness at once. I learned to say no when necessary and yes when small mercies mattered. The ledger in the kitchen drawer, sometimes a physical notebook, sometimes a file I could not close, recorded the days we were careful and the days we failed, medication notes, caregiver logs, receipts from dinners meant to bridge conversations. After we had formalized many plans, my mother began to use old scripts to seek help from neighbors and distant acquaintances. She mailed letters and made urgent requests, asking favors of people she thought might be more susceptible. Sometimes she would call friends midday with a charged story designed to elicit compassion. When the pleas reached kind ears, people often responded with care. "I can't manage this," friends would say gently, and my mother, accustomed to being the giver, found herself in the awkward posture of asking and re-asking. Once, in the rain, she came to my door hatless and apologetic, looking like a supplicant from a different domestic grammar. She did not always ask for money. Sometimes she asked simply to come in out of the cold to be seen. That night we let her in. She pressed her hands around the mug of tea I offered and said, wetly and honestly, "Thank you." Later she meant all of it, the knock, the visits that accumulated, those small labors that kept her from more evident desolation. By 2013 we prepared as if for a slow lowering of the tide. Bright traits, quick jokes, a surprising recall of some names, grew less reliable. She missed names more often, the daily choreography frayed. We built networks deliberately, phone trees, medication lists, contingency plans for hospice. There was both dread and tenderness in those preparations. When the end came it was not dramatic. The crescendo one imagines in novels did not arrive. Instead the music thinned until there were fewer notes, naps replacing conversation, long silences where stories once lived. On a day that remains sharp in my memory, she reached for my hand and squeezed. "Thank you," she said. I asked, "For what?" She meant the rainy night knock, certainly, but she also seemed to mean the ledger of small refusals. My insistence on boundaries, the way I had sometimes said no, the long labor of showing limits and creating space for mercy. I cried, an inward release of grief braided with relief. We held a modest service in late 2014. My sister read a piece she had written for a long time and performed the rare courage of letting it sit in the room without enlarging or mincing it, an honest recognition that people can be wrong and yet capable of repair. Friends and neighbors came, some who had watched the negotiations closely, some who had been quieter witnesses. The woman from the grocery who remembered my mother's preferred apples, the vendor at the farmer's market who had once offered a pie. Someone brought a pie to the reception. Someone else told a story that made us laugh through the slack faces of grief. The watch sat in a drawer. I placed it on the table near a stack of photographs rather than pocketing it. It was not a trophy but a marker of complexity, a life both flawed and lived fully. Practical work followed grief with an outsider's efficiency. Calls to the bank, probate matters, a parcel of letters sorted like archaeological strata, all of it required attention. The house, once smelling of tea and conversation, held a peculiar silence. I opened the ledger and read. The entries had become a quiet rain of facts, dates, small apologies, amounts repaid, the name of the woman at the bookstore who had once given me a baby book, the paramedic's wry remark that he was not meant to keep everything. The ledger felt like a relic, not sacred but useful. It testified to the truth that moral repair does not happen in a single dramatic sweep, it lives in the daily labor of living. People sometimes ask whether we are over it, as if grief and responsibility could be checked off the way one completes a task. I refuse that language. Closure implies a neat finality seldom found in life. What exists, instead, is integration, a way my mother's life is stitched into ours that has altered how we behave toward one another. I remember the tea she brought, the night she knocked in the rain, and the watch on my son's wrist. He sometimes looks up at me with an ease that comes from being held, and I know, the daily practices we cultivated made that possible. I keep a small private notebook in which I chart ordinary moments. I write about my son laughing while wearing the dented watch that now bears a salute of his childhood, its mark from a bicycle fall, and about my sister's call at odd hours to ask whether the grocery list included milk. I note the woman at the bookstore who gave me a baby book years ago and later mailed a card after the funeral. These arcs of kindness stitched together. They are fabric, ordinary and durable. The ledger lies in the drawer and I open it sometimes to revisit its arithmetic of repair. The entries are not heroic. They are small: who came by on Tuesday, who paid for a car repair, the hours someone sat with my mother, the repayment of a borrowed sum, an apology accepted. These stitches show that repair is a succession of tiny acts, each one nudging relationships in new directions. From the first seen and unseen moments of December 24, 1999, through the public missteps at the barbecue on June 18, 2000, the double payment at the farmer's market on June 9, 2001, the formalization of care in March 2002, the Thanksgiving rituals begun in 2003, my son's birth in 2005, the missing watch in late 2006, the wrist fracture in October 2007, the emergent signs of dementia in the late 2000s, the March 2011 misnaming, the planning of 2013 and 2014, to the quiet ending in late 2014. There ran a continuity. My mother was generous in both public and private ways and at times confused about boundaries. She paid twice at a stall, slipped checks to a cousin, knocked on my door in the rain, and later, in a clearer hour, thanked me for answering. Those moments form a chain: generosity, error, apology, labor. The watch embodied that continuity. It held theft and repair in equal, unembellished measure. I do not claim heroism. There were times when my anger calcified into longer refusal than it should have, when my withholding taught distance rather than lesson. The ledger recorded my failures as plainly as hers. Where I had kept lists of her missteps, there were entries that marked my impatience. The two columns, her misdeeds and my mercies, began to resemble a conversation. Repair, we learned, is rarely one-sided. It consists of repeated exchanges, practices that build new habits out of the ruins of older ones. When people ask how to begin such a ledger, what to do if the person refuses to participate, I offer practices rather than a blueprint. First, make behavior visible. Record dates and actions not as weapons but as maps. Second, insist on conversation. Invite the person to tell their story and practice speaking words that show awareness. Third, create rituals for repair. A small restitution made openly, an apology read at dinner, a commitment to a task. Fourth, insist on dignity. Help the person find ways to pay, to contribute, to be seen. The ledger's purpose is not to shame, it is to teach. It turns abstract moralities into concrete acts. These practices demand patience. They require a willingness to act when anger lodges in the throat and a readiness to listen when shame surfaces. They require the reliability of a partner who listens and the sober judgment of a sibling who can say plainly when a boundary must be upheld. They require humility, the knowledge that we are all fallible and will, one day, need repair. There are, in the small roles of daily life, evidences of what we made together. My sister still calls my son about the grocery list, my husband makes tea in our chipped pot, and the watch keeps time on my son's wrist. I wake sometimes with ledger entries in my head like prayers: the day someone offered help, the time my mother returned a sum, the moment she asked for forgiveness and the room softened. These are small things that aggregate, the unremarkable acts that alter the texture of belonging. Strangers tend to fix on the dramatic moments, the theft, the restitution, because drama is an efficient currency for attention. Yet the broader truth of our story is quieter. Ordinary practices, taking notes, making lists, passing cards with intentions at dinner, have the power to remake relationships when they are taken up consistently. The ledger was a tool for those habits. It did not guarantee moral resurrection. It bore witness to the slow accumulation of small changes rather than a single transformational event. Sometimes, late and alone, I open the ledger and read its plain lines. The pages are not heroic inscriptions but catalogues of attending: who came on Tuesday, who paid for the car repair, the hour someone sat with my mother, the repayment of a borrowed sum, the apology accepted. They show that repair is not an event but a labor. They show that mercy needs structure and that structure without mercy hardens into administration. Real repair, honest repair, looks like ordinary acts performed for one another: cups of tea, lists read aloud at Thanksgiving, the unpaid patience that over time builds into family. I end without a neat conclusion. There is no moral sewn and ribboned, no final seal of absolution. What remains is a durable conviction that repair matters and that the daily practices we keep can change the contours of how we do business with one another. The ledger lies in the drawer. I open it sometimes not to relive but to remind myself of the arithmetic of living with another, the small deposits, the little sums repaid, the acts of presence that add up. The woman at the bookstore who gave me a baby book years ago sent a card after the funeral. My sister still calls about milk. My son wears the watch and laughs when it bumps his sleeve. These are the ordinary acts that stitch the world back together. Undramatic, imperfect, and finally proof that mercy has weight, that repair is work, and that loving someone enough to hold them accountable can be one of the most practical ways to care. There are small clarifications that time makes necessary. The Christmas I keep returning to, December 24, 1999, was not remarkable for its weather or for the turkey. It was ordinary in those ways. What made it memorable was the social choreography of gift-giving and omission. My mother had always been generous in a public way, and on that night she moved through the room with parcels and paper and bows, handing out presents with a flourish that made some people laugh and others look slightly embarrassed. She gave gifts to cousins who had not been to our house in years, to neighbors who preferred anonymity, to the woman from the grocery who liked a certain kind of apple, and to my husband, who accepted with a half-smile. She did not, conspicuously, give me anything. I remember feeling the small, hard knot of it, an irritation that had something to do with old grievances and something to do with the shifting economy of our household. 2 weeks after that arranged abundance, she stood on my porch in the rain and knocked. That knock, sometime in early January 2000, was not theatrical. It was the action of someone who had run out of other options. She was wet, embarrassed, and oddly apologetic in a way she had not been in public moments of magnanimity. She asked for help, and for a moment the ledger that would later govern so much of our behavior had not yet been opened. We had, in those years, been learning to catalogue wrongs and remedies with a kind of stubborn civility. The ledger as method came into sharper focus later, in the years around March 2002, when care became formalized. Still, the rainy night knock was an early test of the practices we would later make procedural: a boundary set in private, a refusal offered, a contingency accepted. When she squeezed my hand the last time, in late 2014, and said, "Thank you," I understood that she meant the sequence that began that winter night. A series composed of refusals, restorations, and the slow arithmetic of repair. Chronology matters because it shows how acts accumulate and change value. The public mistake at the barbecue on June 18, 2000, an ill-advised joke, a comment that landed the wrong way, was processed differently after the Christmas omission and the January knock. Where once such a misstep might have been laughed off, it now fed into a ledger of patterns. The double payment at the farmer's market on June 9, 2001, which had been a kindly error and then an embarrassment, was reread in light of other small lapses. The formalization of care in March 2002, a meeting where we attempted to set practical limits on generosity and spending, became the institutional manifestation of a practice that had begun in kitchen conversations and hallway negotiations. Each date is not simply a marker, each is a decision point. The ledger we kept in that period was secular and painstaking. It recorded small transactions, dinners paid, the years people had held a chair for her at church, the hours a neighbor sat when a cough was bad. It also recorded the harder things: the times she gave away money without consulting those closest to her, the checks that appeared and then disappeared, the occasions when an apology was offered and accepted in fitting tones. We made entries that were deliberately unemotional. December 24, 1999, gifts given to X, Y, Z. No gift to narrator. Note: discuss at next family meeting. And 2 weeks later, another line: early January 2000, rainy night knock at narrator's door, mother requests temporary assistance. Action: provide emergency shelter for night, assess needs. Over time, the ledger's dry language helped soften blame. It turned the painful into the manageable. This is not to say that the ledger eliminated unpredictability or mystery. Human behavior resisted reduction. Still, the ledger allowed us to translate feeling into action. When my son was born in 2005, the ledger included the small kindnesses that accompanied that event. The neighbor who brought a casserole in August, the woman at the bookstore who gave a baby book and later mailed a card after the funeral. It also included the awkward entry of late 2006 when my mother's watch went missing. The watch, a thing of brass and scratches that had come to represent a knot in our family history, was found and examined, and its absence prompted conversations about trust and about how objects come to bear stories. The watch's dents, one from the bicycle fall my son took and another from the grease of a mechanic's hand, accrued meaning. It was not merely a timepiece, it was an index of relationship. It did what many objects do: it carried memory in its scratches. When, in October 2007, my son broke his wrist, the watch's dent became part of the tale told then and retold later, the 1,000 small overlaps of care and accident that make up family life. The ledger recorded the fracture, the hours spent at the hospital, the kindnesses paid out in tea and rides and patience. It recorded also that the watch, repaired and redenoted, kept time with a new narrative. The late 2000s were when emergent dementia first asserted itself in ways that could not be reorganized by lists. The misnaming in March 2011, calling my sister by my aunt's name during a family dinner, was a crack that spread. It revealed how fragile identity can be when it is placed under erosion. We intensified the ledger, not as a punishment but as a framework to keep dignity intact. Entries noted the dates of confusion, sure, but also recorded the compensations we made, color-coded pillboxes, a neighbor's offer to drive on Tuesdays, a friend who agreed to check in monthly. When we planned in 2013 for the slow lowering of the tide, we did so with a ledger in hand and with an understanding that planning was itself a kind of mercy. The hospice decision, the conversations that led to the quiet ending in late 2014, were less a single moment than a series of refusals and acceptances. Hospice did not end the ledger, it transformed it into an account of presence. Notes shifted, November 2014, hospice engaged. Action, rotate visits. December 2014, increase in naps, speech intermittent. The watch, the ledger, the casserole, the calls about milk, these were all different forms of accompaniment. At the modest service in late 2014, the watch sat on the table, not as evidence of victory but as an object that had passed through many hands and many small acts of repair. After the funeral, post-2014 life demanded other kinds of accounting. Probate matters, the letters sorted like strata, were a continuation of the ledger's public side. The private ledger, however, kept running. There were entries that only my sister and I made. January 2015, clean out mother's closet. Find box of letters from 1988 to 1994. Note, scan and share with family. We kept those smaller notations not out of obligation to accuracy but as a way to preserve a lineage of care. My son grew, and his relationship to these artifacts evolved. He learned to wind the watch when it slowed, to listen to the stories that attached to the dented metal. He sometimes teased his mother with an impersonation of boiling tea. The ledger taught him that memory could be both preserved and made humane. There were public reverberations. Friends who had been peripheral became involved in new ways. The woman at the bookstore remained a small constant, a person whose card after the funeral was an act of public mourning. The vendor at the farmer's market lent us a bag of onions now and then. Sometimes he would smile and remark that the world was finally making sense. These acts were small, but together they formed a social economy of reciprocity that the ledger traced. It could not mandate kindness, any more than law could mandate grief. It simply made patterns visible so that choices could be deliberate. I learned, over the years, to teach with the ledger. I taught my son the practice of making entries, not to tally wrongs as weapons but to note interventions as responsibilities. We wrote down who visited on Tuesday, and who paid for the car repair, and who sat with mother on March 12th. Sometimes we revisited entries like a liturgy, reading aloud the list of those who had shown up, naming acts of service as if the naming itself were a benediction. This practice, begun in the domestic sphere, has the effect of a civic education. It shows a child how to inhabit public responsibilities and private boundaries. It also teaches an ethic of repair, that when someone injures, restitution is a process, not a spontaneous feeling. There were, inevitably, mistakes. I made plenty. The ledger records my impatience as plainly as it records my mother's excesses. There were times when I overreached in boundary and made absences into punishments. There were times when my sister, too, set lines that were sharper than necessary. Those entries mattered. They taught us that accountability should be mutual. The ledger does not absolve. It invites us to look back with specificity and then to look forward with intention. In the broader social context, the neighborhood meetings, the occasional op-ed someone sent me about elder care policy, the informal conversations at the PTA, our family's ledger resonated. People liked the idea that moral labor could be made legible. There were conversations, in 2016 and thereafter, about whether such practices scale. Could a ledger-like method be used in community centers, in churches, in volunteer networks? I did not have a full answer. What I knew was that for families, Making behavior visible created openings for repair that would not otherwise exist. It did not always turn misdeed into contrition. Sometimes it only contained the harm so that we could live with it and learn from it. The watch continues to be a site of teaching. My son started school in 2011, and by the time he reached adolescence he had developed a habit of tucking the watch under a sleeve when he wanted to smell the leather or feel the weight of time on his wrist. When he was 11 he asked me a practical and piercing question: "Will you write down when I mess up so I can fix it?" That question took me by surprise. I told him that the ledger was not a list of sins to be used against him, but a map for learning. We started a small notebook for him in 2017, an extension of sorts of the family ledger, where we recorded things like May 2017, forgot to call grandma, apology made and agreed to weekly calls, and September 2018, washed car without permission, repaid $10 for wax. These are not weighty notations, but they teach a habit of noticing and making amends. There are things no ledger captures. The textures of voice, the way my mother's laughter filled a kitchen, the precise angle of sunlight on a November day when she told a story for the 100th time and I listened as if it were new, these escape notation. Yet the ledger enables the practical work that supports those textures. It ensures that someone remembers the day of a doctor's appointment, that checks do not vanish, that condolences are offered in a timely way. It is a structure for mercy. The larger lesson is that ethics are practical. They are found in the small lists and the repeated phone calls as much as in grand gestures. From December 24, 1999, through each subsequent entry, June 18, 2000, June 9, 2001, March 2002, Thanksgiving 2003, 2005, late 2006, October 2007, March 2011, the plans of 2013, and the quiet close of late 2014, a kind of grammar emerged. It was a grammar of presence and boundary, of saying no and then being ready to rearrange the table to include a person in need. The ledger was a ledger of living. People sometimes ask whether this method can erase pain. It cannot. It can, however, make pain intelligible. It can give people a way to act when they feel too raw to think. The ledger's entries, dry and patient, are a rehearsal of responsibility. They teach the body how to behave toward the errant and towards those who prosper. They are practices that can be learned, taught, and multiplied. I do not presume to have finished with repair. The work continues in the daily rituals I keep: making tea in a chipped pot, answering the phone when my sister calls about milk, teaching my son to wind a watch and to tell the story attached to each dent. I keep opening the ledger not to relive wounds but to remember the arithmetic of being human. The small deposits, the little sums repaid, the acts of presence that, over time, add up to a kind of belonging. The ledger is not a final document, it is a living one, and as long as I make entries it remains an instrument for shaping the way we go on with one another. The watch on my son's wrist keeps time and, in its own modest way, reminds us that repair is not a single event but a series of deliberate acts that stretch forward into the days I have yet to write down. December 25, 2013, reads in the ledger like a line in a playbill: Christmas dinner. Location: 4, Birch Street. Attendees: family, neighbors, 6 adults, 2 children. Gifts distributed, except to R. The notation is spare because, at the time, I wanted to keep it that way. The room held its usual hum: plated yams, the slow steam of gravy, the cedar smell of the tree, but there was an odd economy to that night. My mother, who had always taken pleasure in the choreography of giving, went around the table with small wrapped packages, depositing them by elbows and knees, paying a kind of social debt with ribbon and the exactitude of someone who knows each recipient's appetite. She handed a small tin of biscotti to the bookstore woman, a wool scarf to my sister, a brass keychain to our neighbor who mows 2 lawns a week. Each gift landed like a syllable in a sentence everyone understood. When she came to me she paused. She searched not for a name but for a shape. Her hands, which once tied ribbons with quick, sure loops, hesitated. There was a bowl of gifts on the mantel that she had been dividing for an hour, and yet when she reached, she took one more for herself. A small pair of reading glasses, the prescription wrong, the packaging warm from where a friend had wrapped it in the kitchen, and then she continued to the back of the room as if the script had altered. My sister nudged me under the table. My son looked at me wide-eyed. Later the ledger would mark the moment simply: December 25, 2013, omission noted. Possible cause, confusion versus intent unknown. Reaction, embarrassment. Distance created between R and M. 2 weeks later, on January 8, 2014, the ledger recorded in a different hand, January 8, mother at R's door, knocking continuously from 7:12 p.m. to 7:27 p.m. Request, entry, need for money, verbal confusion noted, asked R for forgiveness and bread, refused to speak with sister on phone. My mother stood on the stoop with a small, damp shopping bag, the curl of her hair flattened by the cold. She was not, by outward appearances, a desperate figure. No collapsed coat, no frantic pleading, but the cadence of her voice was off, as if she were trying to thread an old tune with a new memory. She begged me for money, she begged me for forgiveness, and she begged, more than anything, for permission to exist on terms I could recognize. The ledger was not merely a record of names and items. It was the slow collection of thresholds crossed, the night calls that turned to repeated nights, the Tuesday drives that became weekly ambulances, the ways the social world reconfigured to accommodate a mind that was rearranging itself. The January 8th entry sits between others like a hinge. It forced two questions. Had she intentionally excluded me on Christmas, or had that exclusion been the predictable misfire of a mind that had, for months, been skipping beats? And what do you do when the person who once distributed grace begins to appear to you as both petitioner and puzzle? In the weeks that followed, we treated the Christmas incident as a diagnostic event rather than as an heirloom of resentment. January 9th, follow-up, review bank records, review gift list, the ledger says. There was a small audit. My sister and I went through statements and envelopes, searching for evidence of slights and of loss. We found nothing of malice. My mother had not redirected funds, she had not written a letter excluding me. What we did find were notes in her handwriting, fragmented lists, bread, call Cynthia. Keys, find. The lists themselves had become a kind of fragmented language. Dementia, we learned in meetings with Dr. Hargreaves, February 4, 2014, neurology consult, possible vascular contribution, does not speak in sophistry, it speaks in decrees of absence. It takes away the ease with which you map cause to effect. It substitutes instead a landscape of partial certainties. The ledger became our lie of land, markers showing where to plant the next cairn. We documented the visits, the times she left the house without shoes, the days she would call my neighbor and give away a ceramic rooster she had painted in 1976. We noted, on February 18, 2014, increased sundowning. Aggressive confusion in late afternoons. We arranged shifts. We made color-coded calendars for February and March. We learned, by trial and sometimes embarrassment, that the thing we most wanted from her was a continuity she could no longer provide. The begging at my door image, so raw and fraught, changed over time from accusation to plea to lesson. My initial hurt hardened into a procedural sympathy. The ledger entry of January 8, 2014 became a training example for visitors and caregivers. Case Study A, what to do when arrival on stoop includes request for money and apology. Response, provide food, do not exchange cash, call sister, stay outside until ambulance evaluation if confused. The ledger, which had begun as a domestic tool, quietly acquired a clinical side. We were, without intending it, constructing an archive of decline. As 2014 unfolded, the entries multiplied with the relentlessness of a calendar. March 2014, in-home care increased, Tuesdays, Thursdays, supplies purchased. May 7, 2014, financial review, no exploitation found. July, neighbor report, found mother in front yard at 2:40 a.m., returned home safely. These were practical measures, but they also carried a moral freight. Each line was a small refusal to let shame be the only story. We recorded who helped so that gratitude, like medication, might be dosed properly. By November 2014, we had reached several convergences that had been preparing themselves over the previous year. The hospice decision, which appears in the ledger as November 2014, hospice engaged. Goals, manage pain, prioritize dignity, was not new, it was the result of many small acceptances. The weeks between January and November were filled with such acceptances. Legal consultations, August 3, 2014, attorney meets durable power, phone calls to distant relatives, and the careful negotiation of moments when my mother's mind seemed, in flashes, to return to the person we had known. There were afternoons when she recognized my son and called him by his nickname. There were mornings when she mistook the toaster for a telephone. We learned the rhythm of those returns, and we recorded them. September 2014, lucid morning with recollection of 1967 trip, sang Blue Moon at 10:22 a.m. The funeral in late 2014 was small, as earlier recorded. After the service, the ledger's public strand, probate, wills, executor assignments, unfolded like another set of entries. January 2015, probate filed, executor named. But the private ledger kept going, in notebooks and in the small adhesive notes taped to the inside of drawers. In March 2015 we found a box of letters, noted in the ledger as January 2015, clean out closet, box found, 1988 to 1994. We scanned them as we had intended, making digital copies on March 12, 2015. In April we sent those scans to family members with a short explanatory note, for memory, for repair. Those letters mattered because they revealed the ways my mother had practiced generosity even when memory was still intact. There were letters from friends who praised her for bringing soup during illness, letters to my father from neighbors who thanked him for mending a roof. The ledger's tone changed then, softened not in content but in address. We began to annotate with emotion. April 2, 2015, letters scanned. Note, tenderness in phrasing. Tenderness to be read aloud to son. My son grew with those readings. The ledger that had been a family tool became his education in how to be present. In May 2017 we opened a small notebook for him. May 2017, son's accountability notebook begun. And there we taught him the simple arithmetic of responsibility. If you take, you must return. If you harm, you must make amends. That practice, begun in domestic routine, had public echoes. By summer 2016, at neighborhood association meetings, people were asking whether a ledger could be used for communal caregiving. June 2016, neighborhood pilot considered. Action, church group to pilot ledger in October 2016, reads an entry. By October the pilot was underway. The parish listed volunteers, schedules, and small payment arrangements for rides. The ledger's use in community settings was not uncontroversial. There were concerns about privacy, about the bureaucratization of care. In November 2016 a local paper published a short column that quoted our approach. The op-ed author praised transparency but warned of legal pitfalls. We made an entry that month, November 2016, op-ed. Action, cautious outreach, consult privacy lawyer. We also took comfort in the fact that in the winter of 2017, when a neighbor's wife was hospitalized, the church ledger, an offshoot of our method, ensured rides, warm meals, and a child-minding roster that kept a small family afloat. Over time the ledger became less about correcting individual wrongs and more about organizing a social response to fragility. It taught us that accountability need not be punitive. The ledger's entries became a kind of lesson plan for grief and for repair. When my sister and I argued, an entry in July 2015, family dispute bedside decisions, cooled in 48 hours, we recorded the argument and the resolution together. Those pages taught us that mistakes do not nullify love. They taught us that memory and moral obligation can coexist in the same document. The watch remained a central symbol. It appears in entries throughout. October 2007, watch dented, sun fell. December 2014, watch placed on service table. March 2018, sun wins watch, notes dent. The watch is an index of time in two senses, clock time and lived time. In 2019 my son began to carry it to school on occasion, tucking it in the pocket of his jacket. He would pull it out during quiet periods and wind it, listening to the little tick as if it were a metronome for attention. In August 2019 he asked, with a seriousness I recognized from my own childhood, whether one day he could wear it to his own children. I told him that of course he could and that the watch's scars were not stains but inscriptions. The ledger continued to be an instructional tool beyond our family. In 2018 and 2019 there were workshops at the local community center. April 2018, Community Ledger Workshop, attendance 28, where neighbors learned how to document visits, how to schedule check-ins, and how to balance dignity with safety. We taught people how to make entries that were neutral and not shaming, did visit, rather than did not call. The language itself became an ethic. The more precise the note, the less likely it was to be weaponized. Then came an event that reoriented our relationship to public health more generally. In March 2020, the pandemic entered the ledger. March 15, 2020, COVID-19 emergency, operations altered. Action, suspend in-home volunteers, shift to phone check-ins. The ledger adapted. We drafted entries that were designed not only to document but to maintain social fabrics under strain. Meal deliveries organized, March 20, 2020, meals, 25 delivered, medication pickups, April 2, 2020, pharmacy pickup schedule, and video calls scheduled for the son and cousin. The ledger proved its utility again, this time as a means of keeping people apart safely while keeping the threads of care intact. As my son matured, the ledger's lessons deepened into habit. He learned to look for the hidden patterns in daily life, the small omissions, the recurring kindnesses. In October 2021, he began an internship at a local clinic. The ledger's vocabulary was evident on his clipboard. He wrote notes, October 12, 2021, patient missed meds, arranged delivery. He had internalized the practice. Notarizing responsibility is itself a moral act. I continue to make entries, and not out of compulsion but out of a belief that notation shapes behavior. The ledger still holds January 8, 2014, in tension with December 25, 2013. Those contiguous entries remind me that people can move from giving to asking, from authority to need, sometimes within the space of a week. They teach an ethic of response. And they remind me that wounds are often complicated. My mother's omission on Christmas was both an affront and an artifact of illness. Her appearance at my door 2 weeks later was both shame and plea. There are days when I sit with the ledger and read aloud to my son the short, clinical sentences we once used to manage logistics. He listens not as if to a tally, but as if to a set of instructions about how to be human. We pause at certain lines, October 2007, March 2011, November 2014, and he asks what it felt like to be present in those moments. I tell him the truth. Sometimes it felt like keeping a small fire alive, sometimes like watching an orchard's slow decline. The ledger, which began as a map for pragmatic care, has become a curriculum for moral attention. What remains unsettled is the question the ledger never fully answers. How do you hold someone accountable for the ways their failing mind can wound you? The ledger helps by making acts visible, by providing a script for repair. But it cannot insulate the heart from the sudden hurt of being omitted, nor can it erase the small shame of being the person who must say no. In the end, the ledger's greatest lesson may be the humility of limitation. There is much we can record and enact, and much we must still bear without remedy. The ledger is, in that sense, both an instrument and a companion. It does not sanctify memory, it provides the machinery for living. I keep writing because the practice has taught me how to see the world as a sequence of duties and gifts, sometimes overlapping, sometimes in conflict, always subject to the slow arithmetic of care. The watch keeps time, the ledger keeps faith with time. And as the years roll on, marked in neat entries in messy handwriting, in photographs scanned and sent to cousins across the country, our account continues to be written, not as a ledger of blame but as an ongoing record of how we choose to keep each other. The last lines, whatever they may be, will not end the work. They will merely be one more entry in a book that, for as long as I live, I will keep open. January 8, 2014 is marked in the ledger as a kind of hinge. It sits beside December 25, 2013, two short notations that, read together, tell a small story of reversal. The Christmas entry is terse, December 25, 2013, family dinner. Mom distributes gifts to table, omits narrator. Note, observed. Tone, embarrassed. The January entry is longer for reasons that have nothing to do with ink. January 8, 2014, 2:10 a.m., knock at door. Mom at step, asking for help, apologetic, I forgot you repeated. Action, let in tea, mattress placed in living room, yard at 2:40 a.m., returned home safely. Those lines, which began as practical logistics, eventually became a small moral textbook for us, how memory's failure can be both an offense and an appeal. The 2-week gap between omission and pleading felt longer than it was. In the ledger, we tried to capture that stretch as precisely as possible, because precision felt like a moral obligation. We wrote down what we felt as well as what we did. January 8, 2014. Son asleep, awakened, mother's face pale. Note, my anger returned after she left. Note, son awoke at 3:15 a.m., asked will grandma be okay? And we left space for later interpretation. There were practical choices that had to be made in the moment. We could have called emergency services, we could have refused entry, we could have demanded an explanation. Instead we chose a set of small, stabilizing acts: tea, a blanket, a low-voiced conversation about why she had come. We recorded them. January 8, 2014, provided blanket, conversation memory lapses, no ambulance. Later, after the sun rose and the ledger's ink dried, the argument began. My sister accused me of indulgence. You made it easy for her to come back, she said on January 10, an entry that reads, January 10, 2014, family argument enabling. Cooled by Wednesday. I wrote back into the ledger what I could not say in the heat of the moment, that leaving her on the porch in the middle of January would have been a cruelty I could not live with. The ledger captured both positions with the same stoicism. January 10 to 13, 2014, disagreement documented. Mediated by phone call, resolution, in-home check-ins to be increased. Those check-ins were concrete. We scheduled neighbors to call, set alarms on our phones, and instituted a no walking alone after dusk rule for her. A rule that appears in the ledger as January 16, 2014, safety plan instituted. No unsupervised outings after dusk. Volunteer, neighbor M. We also began to ask whether there was a way to repair the wound of the Christmas omission, not by forcing contrition but by making amends visible. On January 18 I wrote, action, choir recording of carol to send, small voucher for dinner delivered. The ledger treats amends as acts of repair that must be witnessed and recorded so that repair is not solely private, because private repairs can be erased by the next lapse of memory. The ledger's entries around those weeks are granular because that granularity protected us from two dangers: the temptation to forget in the name of mercy and the temptation to punish in the name of memory. We learned to separate the act from the person, to annotate the omission without annotating the whole life. There is an entry from February 2, 2014 that I still read aloud sometimes. February 2, 2014, visited. Mentioned 1967 trip to Maine, glimpsed lucidity, acknowledged Christmas omission, mother expressed shame, response, forgiveness offered aloud by narrator. That moment, her shame and our forgiveness made audible, was not a cure, but it was a moral reconciliation documented for the future. In the months that followed the January incident, we began to translate private practices into public ones. The ledger's method, neutral language, time-stamped actions, named volunteers, was shaped by the necessity of those early nights. March 2014, protocol drafted, door knock procedure, temperature checks, night call roster, reads 1 page. By June we had formalized a small packet of instructions: how to receive a late-night caller with dignity, how to involve neighbors without broadcasting shame, and how to ensure that small acts of neglect did not metastasize into abandonment. Those packets were photocopied and handed to neighbors. They were also scanned and added to the digital archive of March 12, 2015. There were legal consultations, of course. The entry August 3, 2014, attorney meets durable power, is also the ledger's pragmatic edge. We sought structures that would protect both autonomy and safety, recognizing that the law is sometimes blunt when the heart requires nuance. On the same page we wrote, August 4, 2014, consider limited POA for medical decisions only. Action, revisit hospice if decline continues. We kept returning to that word, hospice, because it signaled a shift from correcting to accompanying. The hospice decision, November 2014, hospice engaged. Goals, manage pain, prioritize dignity, was the culmination of many small acceptances, and the ledger records those acceptances as carefully as it did the incidents that precipitated them. After the funeral in late 2014, when the ledger's public strand, probate, wills, executor assignments, unfolded, the private ledger continued to hold the memory of that Christmas and of the January doorstep. Those entries became, for my son, a primer in how to hold conflicting emotions at once. He read aloud the lines from February 2, 2014, and asked why we had written forgiveness offered aloud. I told him that sometimes offering forgiveness is a practical action. It frees you to tend to the living without being paralyzed by grievance. The ledger taught him that forgiveness need not erase accountability. It can coexist with procedures to prevent harm. As the ledger's method migrated to community use, workshops in April 2018, the pilot program in October 2016, the op-ed in November 2016, it carried with it the moral residue of that Christmas omission and the January plea. People asked me, in those workshops, whether it was right to record an argument or a shameful omission. My answer was to show them the entry itself, neat, non-judgmental, and intended to make repair possible. The ledger has a pedagogical posture. It teaches that naming an injury is the first step toward remediation. It also teaches that naming must be precise enough to be useful and humane enough to avoid shaming. The pandemic of 2020 tested those lessons. When we shifted to phone check-ins and contactless deliveries, the ledger entries multiplied. March 20, 2020 meals, 25 delivered, April 2, 2020, pharmacy pickup schedule, April 10, 2020, video call initiated. The ledger's language, did visit rather than didn't call, was useful precisely because it prevented neighbors from collapsing into moralizing silence. Where silence could have permitted neglect, documentation insisted on a minimal standard of care. 2 events after 2020 clarified how durable those practices could be. First, my son's internship at the clinic in October 2021 showed me how the ledger's vocabulary had become portable. He wrote clinical notes in the same careful, neutral tone we had used at home. October 12, 2021, patient missed meds, arranged delivery. Later he told me that the clinic staff found the ledger model useful because it translated well into coordination among clinicians, social workers, and family members. The second event was less institutional and more intimate. In March 2022, on what would have been my mother's 79th birthday, my son asked whether we would play the choir recording we had sent in January 2014. We did, and while listening he said, "It sounds like her." The ledger's small acts of repair had a long echo. From 2022 onward the ledger began to change shape. Neighbors who had once been wary of documentation began to ask whether they could use the format for their block parties, for volunteer rides, and for a mutual aid pantry. May 2022, Mutual Aid Ledger Trial, Attendance 12, reads an entry.